When was the last time you made a decision based on what you wanted, not on what other people expected from you? Many of us spend years trying to be the good daughter, the supportive partner, the reliable friend, or the person who never lets anyone down. We become so focused on keeping everyone else happy that, somewhere along the way, we stop asking ourselves a simple question: what do I actually want? The problem is that living for other people's approval is exhausting. No matter how much you give, it never feels like enough, and the harder you try to please everyone, the easier it becomes to lose yourself. Most people believe they need to become someone better in order to feel worthy, loved, or accepted. But what if the real challenge isn't becoming someone new? What if it's having the courage to stop hiding who you already are? In this audiobook, you'll discover why so many people struggle with guilt, people-pleasing, and self-doubt, and how learning to trust yourself can change every area of your life. Stay until the end, because one idea in this book may help you see yourself in a completely different way. And before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new audiobooks. And now, let's begin.
Introduction. For most of my adult life, I followed a script I never consciously chose. I was the dependable one, the helpful colleague, the accommodating partner, the daughter who never caused trouble. I earned degrees, built a career in psychology, published papers, mentored students, raised children, and kept the household running with a precision that impressed everyone around me. From the outside, it looked like success. From the inside, it felt like slow suffocation. The turning point was quiet. One morning, sitting in my office before a full day of client sessions, I realized I could not remember the last time I had done something simply because I wanted to. Not because it was expected, not because someone needed me to, not because it would make me look competent or caring, just because it mattered to me. That realization was unsettling, and it became the seed of this book. What I experienced was not unique. Over 2 decades of clinical practice, I have sat across from hundreds of women who described versions of the same story. Smart, capable, generous women who had spent years performing a role that left no room for their own desires, opinions, or boundaries. Women who had been trained from childhood to be pleasant, agreeable, and self-sacrificing, and who had done it so well that they had lost track of who they actually were underneath all that effort. This book is about that role, the one I call the good girl script, and about the quiet courage it takes to step out of it. This is a book in favor of something precise, learning to distinguish between who you are and who you were trained to be without abandoning the kindness that is genuinely yours. In the chapters ahead, we will examine where this script comes from, what it costs, and how to begin rewriting it. I will draw on research in psychology, cognitive science, and behavioral change, as well as on stories from my practice and my own life. My goal is to give you practical tools for thinking more clearly about the beliefs and patterns that may be shaping your life without your full awareness. If you have ever felt exhausted by the effort of being everything to everyone, if you have ever suspected that the life you are living is not quite your own, this book is for you. This book is organized in 4 parts. In Part 1, we trace the origins of the script, from childhood programming through the cultural machinery that keeps it running. In Part 2, we confront the price. Part 3 equips you with practical tools. And Part 4 addresses the deeper foundations: self-esteem, money, ambition, and the fear of being alone. A note on sources and methods. The clinical stories in this book are drawn from over 2 decades of practice. All names and identifying details have been changed to protect confidentiality. Research findings are referenced in the notes section at the end of the book, where I describe personal experiences. They are my own, shared because I believe a psychologist who asks her readers to be honest should be willing to do the same. Part 1 takes us back to the beginning, to the childhood messages, the cultural scripts, and the social systems that together build the architecture of the good girl role. Understanding where the script comes from is the first condition for changing it. Part 1. Where does the good girl syndrome come from? Chapter 1. Programming from childhood. Long before a girl forms her first conscious opinion about the world has already formed several opinions about her. By the time she can speak in full sentences, she has absorbed thousands of subtle messages about who she should be, how she should behave, and what she must do to earn love. No one designs this process intentionally. It is the ordinary, invisible machinery of socialization. Parents, caregivers, teachers, and relatives transmit beliefs and expectations, most of them without realizing it. The phrases are familiar to almost every woman I have worked with. Don't be difficult. Let your brother go first. Good girls don't shout. If you're nice, people will like you. Individually, each phrase seems harmless, even sensible. Collectively, over years, they form something more powerful, a blueprint for how to exist in the world. That blueprint can be summarized in a single unspoken rule. Your value depends on how comfortable you make other people feel. This is what I mean by programming, not in the conspiratorial sense, but in the cognitive one. Children learn through repetition and reinforcement. When a girl is praised for being quiet, accommodating, and helpful, and corrected or ignored when she is loud, assertive, or demanding, she learns a cause and effect relationship that becomes deeply embedded. Compliance equals love, and self-assertion equals rejection. In developmental psychology, this process is well documented. Children develop what the psychologist John Bowlby, 1969, called internal working models, mental templates for how relationships function. These models are built primarily from early interactions with caregivers, and they shape expectations about whether the world is safe, whether people can be trusted, and what one must do to maintain connection. For many girls, the internal working model that takes root is this: I must anticipate what others need and provide it. If I do not, I risk being abandoned or unloved. This model does not expire at adolescence. It follows women into adult life, where it operates silently but powerfully. In romantic relationships, it manifests as a compulsive need to manage a partner's emotions, to smooth over conflicts rather than address them, to say, I'm fine when nothing is fine. In the workplace, it appears as chronic overfunctioning, difficulty saying no, reluctance to negotiate for better pay, and a deep fear of being perceived as difficult. In friendships, it shows up as the habit of always being the one who listens, supports, and gives, while rarely asking for anything in return. The cost of this pattern is not always obvious at first. For a while, it can look like success. The accommodating woman is often well-liked, praised, and relied upon. She may receive promotions for her reliability. She may be told she is the easy one in her family, the friend everyone counts on, the partner who never causes drama. All of this positive reinforcement strengthens the program. It tells her she is doing the right thing, but there is a slow erosion happening beneath the surface. Each time, a woman suppresses a genuine feeling to keep the peace. Each time she says yes when she means no. Each time she rearranges her priorities around someone else's needs without being asked, she moves a little further from herself. Over months and years, this distance grows until she reaches a point where she cannot easily identify what she wants, what she feels, or what matters to her outside of her relationships and responsibilities. I have seen this pattern repeat across every demographic, every education level, every culture I have encountered in my clinical work. The specifics vary, the strictness of the expectations, the consequences for deviation, but the core mechanism is remarkably consistent. A girl learns that love is conditional on compliance. A woman lives out that lesson until it breaks her, or until she decides to question it. There is also a deeper cost that deserves mention here, because it sets the stage for much of what follows in this book. When a girl learns that her value lies in her usefulness to others, she does not just develop a behavioral pattern, She develops an identity built around that pattern. She becomes the helpful one, the easygoing one, the one who never makes trouble. And because identity is the most closely guarded thing we possess, any threat to it feels like a threat to survival itself. Women who begin to assert themselves often describe the experience as terror, because they are challenging the very foundation of who they believe themselves to be. What makes this programming so resilient is that it does not feel like programming. It feels like common sense, like basic decency, like the way things naturally are. A woman who has been conditioned to prioritize others does not experience her behavior as a learned response. She experiences it as a personal choice, as evidence of her character. The first step toward change is often the hardest because it demands a new kind of seeing. You cannot change a pattern you do not recognize as a pattern. As long as the compliance feels like authenticity, there is nothing to question. Questioning it is the beginning. A simple, honest inquiry. What do I actually believe, and what was I merely taught to believe? Which of my habits are genuine expressions of who I am, and which are performances designed to keep me safe from disapproval? These are not easy questions, and the answers do not come all at once. But the act of asking them interrupts the automatic program and creates space for something new. The work begins here, with a willingness to notice the programming and to consider, perhaps for the first time, that you are more than what you were trained to be. Chapter 2. Female Scripts. Waiting, Enduring, Pleasing. If childhood programming lays the foundation, social scripts provide the architecture. These scripts are the unwritten rules that tell women how to conduct their lives, not just in childhood, but at every stage. They dictate how a woman should behave in love, at work, in motherhood, and even in grief. And while they are rarely stated aloud in their full form, they are remarkably consistent and surprisingly resistant to change. 3 scripts are especially pervasive. I think of them as the 3 pillars of the good girl syndrome: waiting, enduring, and pleasing. Each one appears to be a virtue. Each one, when examined closely, operates as a trap. Let us look at each one in turn. The first script is waiting. From early adolescence, many girls absorb the idea that the important things in life will come to them if they are patient and deserving enough. The right partner will appear. The promotion will be offered. The recognition will arrive. Rarely is this belief taught explicitly. It is transmitted through stories, cultural narratives, and the behavior of the adults around them. The fairy tale structure is simple and deeply embedded. Be good, be patient, and eventually you will be rewarded. In my practice, I have met countless women who followed this script faithfully into their 30s and 40s, only to find that the reward never came, or that when it did, it looked nothing like what they had been promised. One client, a talented architect in her late 30s, spent 8 years at her firm waiting to be recognized and promoted. She did excellent work, stayed late, helped colleagues, and never complained. Meanwhile, less experienced male colleagues who actively lobbied for advancement moved ahead of her. When I asked her why she had never advocated for herself, she looked genuinely puzzled. "I thought if I did good work, it would speak for itself," she said. That sentence could serve as the waiting script's unofficial motto. This belief that merit alone will be recognized without self-advocacy is one of the most damaging forms of the waiting script. It sounds reasonable and even noble, but it ignores a basic reality of how most institutions and relationships operate. Visibility and assertiveness matter. The people who advance are rarely the ones who wait quietly. And yet, for many women, the act of promoting themselves feels deeply uncomfortable, almost morally wrong, because it violates the good girl code of modesty and selflessness. The result is a painful double bind. They are punished for stalling, while the only available path forward requires the very behavior the script forbids. The waiting script also extends beyond the professional realm. In personal relationships, it appears as the belief that a good partner will eventually notice what you need without being told. If he really loved me, he would know. This expectation, though emotionally understandable, sets up a dynamic where the woman's needs can only be met through mind reading, which is to say, they usually go unmet. Rather than expressing a need directly, the woman waits, hoping that her goodness and patience will be rewarded with attentiveness. When the attentiveness does not arrive, she does not speak up. She endures. Which brings us to the second script. The second script is enduring. If waiting is about what women expect from the world, enduring is about what they expect from themselves. The enduring script says that a woman's strength is measured by how much she can tolerate. A difficult marriage, an unfair workload, a thankless role in the family, physical exhaustion, emotional neglect, all of these become tests of character rather than problems to be solved. I grew up around women who wore their endurance like a badge of honor. My grandmother raised 5 children while working a factory job and managing a household with almost no help. I remember her hands most vividly, raw and cracked from the chemical cleaning solutions at the plant, still kneading dough for the next morning's bread before she went to bed. She never complained, at least not in front of us. She was held up as an example of what a strong woman looked like. It took me years, and a fair amount of professional training, to understand that what we called strength was actually an inability to ask for help, a deeply internalized belief that her needs did not matter enough to voice. This is the paradox of the enduring script. It reframes self-neglect as virtue. It teaches women that suffering in silence is noble, that asking for less is a sign of weakness, and that the truly strong woman is the one who bears the most without breaking. This script keeps women in damaging situations far longer than they should stay, not because they lack the intelligence to see the damage, but because they have been taught that leaving, complaining, or demanding change is a form of failure. They confuse tolerance with loyalty and exhaustion with dedication. A client I will call Marina came to see me after 15 years in a marriage where she handled all the household responsibilities, all the childcare logistics, all the emotional labor of maintaining extended family relationships, and her full-time job as a project manager. She was sleeping 4 hours a night and had developed chronic migraines. When I asked what she needed, she could not answer. The concept of her own needs had become so foreign that the question itself felt disorienting. She had endured so thoroughly and for so long that she had lost the ability to imagine an alternative. The enduring script had not made her strong. It had made her invisible, even to herself. If enduring is about what a woman expects from herself, pleasing is about what she expects from the space between herself and others. The third script is pleasing, and it is perhaps the most fundamental of the three because it underpins the other two. Waiting and enduring both serve the same deeper goal, earning approval by not causing trouble. The pleasing script says that a woman's primary purpose is to make others comfortable and happy. Her opinions should not cause friction. Her presence should be soothing. Her appearance should be pleasant. Her tone should be warm. And if she fails at any of these, she is the problem. Pleasing operates on a mechanism related to what psychologists Mark Leary and Roy Baumeister have called sociometer theory, the idea that self-esteem functions as an internal gauge of social acceptance. When a woman's sense of self-worth is built primarily on other people's reactions to her, that gauge becomes hypersensitive. A slightly cool email from a colleague can trigger hours of anxious analysis. A partner's bad mood becomes her responsibility to fix. Criticism, even when constructive, feels like evidence of fundamental inadequacy. The pleasing script trains women to treat other people's emotions as the primary data source for their own self-worth, which gives those other people an enormous amount of power that they often do not even know they hold. The pleasing script also creates a particular kind of dishonesty, a chronic editing of the self. Women who operate under this script learn to read rooms instantly and adjust their behavior accordingly. They become skilled at knowing what others want to hear and providing it. They learn to suppress inconvenient emotions, controversial opinions, and genuine reactions in favor of whatever will maintain harmony. Over time, this editing becomes so automatic that many women lose track of where the performance ends and the real person begins. They know what everyone around them wants. They have forgotten what they want. I recall a client who told me she had never once chosen a restaurant when dining with friends. Not because she did not have preferences, but because the act of stating a preference felt dangerous. What if someone did not like her choice? What if it caused a disagreement? So she always said, "I don't mind. You pick." And then spent the meal feeling vaguely dissatisfied without understanding why. This may seem like a trivial example, but it illustrates the pleasing script's reach. It operates not just in the big decisions, but in the smallest moments of daily life, slowly eroding a woman's connection to her own desires, until even choosing a restaurant feels like a risk she cannot afford to take. Let me put this plainly. There is nothing inherently wrong with patience, resilience, or kindness. The qualities are genuine. The problem is how they have been packaged and weaponized into scripts that serve everyone except the woman following them. Waiting is not patience when it means abandoning your own agency. Endurance is not strength when it means tolerating conditions that are slowly destroying you. Pleasing is not kindness when it requires erasing yourself. The path forward begins with recognizing these scripts for what they are, learned patterns, not fixed truths about who you are. You can value patience without waiting passively for your life to happen. You can be resilient without enduring abuse or neglect. You can be kind and generous without making yourself disappear in the process. The scripts are familiar, and letting go of them can feel frightening. But what lies on the other side of them is not emptiness. It is you. The first practical step is to start noticing which script is running in any given moment. When you find yourself staying silent in a meeting, ask, "Am I choosing this? Or is the pleasing script choosing for me?" When you are absorbing someone else's crisis while ignoring your own needs, ask, "Is this genuine care? Or is the endurance script running?" These questions are meant to produce clarity, and clarity, even when it is uncomfortable, is always the first step toward change. Chapter 3: How Society Imposes the Role of the Good Girl. In the previous chapters, we examined how the good girl script begins in childhood and crystallizes into patterns of waiting, enduring, and pleasing. But these patterns do not survive into adulthood on the strength of family conditioning alone. They are reinforced daily by a vast, largely invisible infrastructure of cultural messages, media images, social norms, and institutional expectations. Understanding this infrastructure is essential because you cannot effectively challenge a pattern if you do not see the system that sustains it. The most pervasive source of reinforcement is media. From childhood cartoons to adult dramas, the image of the good woman follows a remarkably consistent template. She is attractive but not threatening, intelligent but not intimidating, successful but not at the expense of her likability. When female characters deviate from this template, they are typically punished by the narrative or positioned as cautionary figures. The ambitious woman is shown as lonely. The outspoken woman is portrayed as difficult. These are not just fictional patterns. They function as implicit instructions, shaping emotional reactions and gut instincts below the level of conscious belief. If media provides the imagery, advertising provides the emotional hook. The message of most advertising directed at women rests on a single premise: you are not enough as you are. You need to be thinner, younger, more organized, more productive, more nurturing. The specific inadequacy shifts with the product, but the underlying message remains constant. And what makes it so effective is that it finds a vulnerability already in place. A woman taught that her value depends on performance has already been conditioned to believe she is always falling short. Advertising, does not create this belief from scratch. It exploits it billions of times a day until the feeling of inadequacy seems like an internal truth rather than an external message. These cultural messages converge in what I call the superwoman expectation, a modern addition to the script that is in some ways more insidious than the older version. The traditional script told women to be good wives and mothers. The superwoman script says, be everything. Excel at your career. Be a devoted, present, creative mother. Maintain an active social life. Stay physically fit. Manage the family's schedule, health, education, and emotional well-being. Do it all with grace. The superwoman expectation is particularly damaging because it wears the mask of empowerment. You can have it all. But having it all in practice means doing it all, usually without a proportional increase in support. Arlie Hochschild documented this dynamic over 3 decades ago, calling it the second shift, the full round of domestic labor that working women perform after their paid workday ends. Research consistently shows that in most heterosexual households, women still perform the majority of domestic labor and childcare, even when both partners work full-time. The superwoman script does not challenge this inequity. It simply adds professional success to an already overwhelming list of expectations and layers guilt on top for any woman who finds the load impossible to carry. I have observed this dynamic up close, both professionally and personally. In my 30s, I was juggling a clinical practice, teaching responsibilities, research projects, 2 young children, and a household. I remember sitting at my desk one evening, preparing a lecture on burnout for the following morning, and suddenly realizing that I was, by every clinical definition I was about to teach, burned out myself. The contradiction was almost funny, except that it was the most serious insight I had had in years. I had not arrived at that state through poor choices or lack of discipline. I had arrived there by trying to fulfill every expectation the culture had placed on my particular combination of roles. The system itself was the problem. Social media has intensified these pressures into something previous generations never faced. The curated images of other women's lives create a constant stream of upward comparison. You see the colleague who seems to manage her career effortlessly, the friend whose children appear creatively stimulated at all times. Intellectually, you understand these images are performative. Emotionally, they register as evidence that you are falling behind. Social comparison research confirms that measuring yourself against people who appear to be doing better consistently lowers self-esteem, and social media provides an almost unlimited supply of such material. Beyond culture and media, institutions play their own reinforcing role. Many organizational cultures still reward women for the very behaviors the script prescribes: agreeableness, emotional labor, willingness to absorb extra tasks without recognition. Linda Babcock and colleagues have documented how women are disproportionately assigned what they call non-promotable tasks, the organizational maintenance work like planning events, taking notes, mentoring newcomers, and mediating team conflicts that is essential but rarely factored into advancement decisions. When a woman declines these tasks, she risks being labeled uncooperative. When she accepts them, she diverts energy from the work that would actually advance her career. The system rewards compliance and penalizes boundaries. Education lays this groundwork even earlier. Myra and David Sadkir's landmark classroom research found that teachers interact differently with boys and girls in ways that reinforce gendered expectations. Boys called on more often, their disruptions tolerated as intellectual energy, while girls are praised for neatness, compliance, and cooperation. Most teachers are unaware of these patterns, but they add another layer of reinforcement to the message that a girl's primary job is to be pleasant, organized, and agreeable. There is one more source of reinforcement that is often too uncomfortable to discuss: other women. Women who are deeply invested in the good girl role sometimes become its most vigilant enforcers, driven by the unconscious need to validate their own choices. If I have sacrificed everything for my family, and you have not, your different choice can feel like a judgment of mine. This dynamic can make female friendships and community spaces surprisingly hostile to women who begin stepping outside the script. What all of these forces share is that they externalize the standard of adequacy. They place the definition of what a woman should be outside the woman herself, in the reactions of others, in cultural images, in social comparison, in institutional expectations. As long as the standard is external, a woman can never fully meet it, because it is always shifting, always expanding. Systems that depend on people's labor tend to perpetuate a gap between what people are and what they believe they should be. That gap generates effort, consumption, and obedience. A woman who feels adequate exactly as she is, who defines her own standards and lives by them, is far less useful to these systems than one who is perpetually striving. Recognizing this requires clarity, not cynicism. Here is a practical exercise I use with clients. Take any role you currently occupy and write down what you believe a good version of that role looks like. Be specific. Then, for each item, ask, where did this expectation come from? Did I choose it based on my own values, or did I absorb it from somewhere else? Most women who do this exercise discover that a significant portion of their expectations for themselves did not originate with them. Some may align with genuine values. But when you can see the source clearly, you gain the ability to choose which expectations to keep and which to release. That ability to choose is the essence of moving from the script to authentic selfhood. It begins with the simple, repeated act of noticing where your standards come from and deciding, consciously, which ones actually belong to you. Now that we have mapped the architecture of the script, we turn to a harder question. What does it cost? The next chapters are an honest accounting of the price women pay for a role that was never designed with their well-being in mind. Part 2. The price of the good girl role. The truth that is not spoken about. Chapter 4. The gap between expectations and reality. There is a particular kind of disappointment that tends to arrive somewhere between the ages of 30 and 45. It is not the sharp disappointment of a sudden loss or betrayal. It is something slower, quieter, and more disorienting. It is the gradual realization that the formula you were given does not work. The formula goes something like this. If you are good, patient, hardworking, and selfless, life will reward you with love, security, recognition, and fulfillment. No one states this formula explicitly, but it is the operational logic of the good girl script. It is the promise embedded in all those childhood messages about being nice, working hard, and putting others first. And for a long time, it can appear to be true. The compliant student gets good grades. The accommodating employee gets positive reviews. The self-sacrificing partner is told she is wonderful. The formula seems to be delivering on its promise. But at some point, for many women, the returns stop matching the investment. The career that was supposed to feel meaningful feels like an obligation. The relationship that was supposed to bring partnership feels like another job. The lifestyle that was supposed to represent success feels hollow and strangely unsatisfying. And the woman who followed every rule finds herself sitting with a question she never expected to face. What was it all for? There is a concept in psychology called the arrival fallacy, a term coined by Tal Ben-Shahar, which describes the false belief that reaching a certain goal or milestone will bring lasting happiness. The good girl version of this fallacy is particularly potent. If I am good enough for long enough, happiness will arrive as a reward. But happiness is not a prize awarded for compliance. It is a byproduct of living in alignment with your own values and desires. When those values and desires have been subordinated to a script for decades, even reaching every milestone on the script's checklist will feel hollow, because the milestones were never truly yours. This gap between expectations and reality is not a personal failure, it is a structural one. The formula was flawed from the beginning because it was built on a false premise that other people's approval is a reliable path to personal fulfillment. Approval feels good in the moment. It can even feel like love. But it is not the same as living a life that reflects your actual values and desires. You can spend decades earning approval and still feel empty, because approval is a response to your performance, not a recognition of your true self. It tells you that the role you are playing is convincing. It tells you nothing about whether the role is actually yours. I encountered this gap in my own life when I changed careers in my mid-30s. I had built a conventional academic path, degrees, publications, teaching positions. By external measures, everything was on track. Colleagues respected my work. My students valued my teaching. My family was proud. But internally, something had shifted. I found myself going through the motions of a career that no longer felt connected to anything real inside me. The work was fine. The students were fine. I was fine. But fine was starting to feel like a beautifully decorated waiting room where nothing ever actually began. The decision to shift toward clinical practice and eventually toward writing and teaching about personal development was not easy. It meant stepping off a path that everyone around me understood and approved of. It meant tolerating the discomfort of not knowing exactly where I was going. It meant accepting that the life I had built was good in many ways but was not fully mine. And it meant facing the good girl script's most powerful weapon, the fear that if I stopped doing what others expected, I would lose their love and respect. What I learned from that experience and what I have seen confirmed hundreds of times in my clinical work is that the moment of recognizing the gap is not a breakdown. It is a breakthrough. It is the point at which reality breaks through the script and offers you something better than approval: information. Specifically, information about what you actually need, as opposed to what you were taught to want. This distinction matters enormously. Many women I work with initially describe their discontent as a character flaw. They say things like, "I should be grateful for what I have," or "other people have real problems," or "what right do I have to complain when my life looks good on paper?" They frame their unhappiness as evidence that something is wrong with them rather than evidence that something is wrong with the formula. This self-blame is itself a product of the good girl script, which teaches that if life is not working, it is because you have not tried hard enough, not because the premises are incorrect. Allowing yourself to question the premises is the critical step. It is also the most frightening one because the premises have been the foundation of your identity for years or decades. Questioning them can feel like the ground is shifting. Who am I if not the responsible one, the reliable one, the one who holds everything together? What if the person underneath all that performing is someone I do not recognize? These fears are real and legitimate, and I do not dismiss them. But I have also watched hundreds of women move through them and arrive at the other side, where they discover that their actual self is not frightening. It is simply unfamiliar. One of the things I observed during my own career transition was how much resistance came from within rather than from the world around me. The people in my life were, for the most part, supportive or at least neutral. The real opposition came from the voice inside my head that kept insisting I was being irresponsible, that I was throwing away everything I had worked for, that I had no right to want something different when what I had was perfectly adequate. That voice was the good girl script, and it was fighting for its survival. Recognizing it as a script rather than as truth did not make it quiet, but it did make it possible to act, despite its protests. The answer, though it takes time to discover, is usually more interesting and more alive than the role you have been playing, because the role was a response to other people's expectations. Your actual self, the one that exists beneath the performance, has desires, preferences, opinions, and capacities that the script never made room for. Getting to know that self is not self-indulgent. It is the most practically important work you can do, because every decision you make from a place of genuine self-knowledge will be more effective and more satisfying than one made from a script. I want to be concrete about what it looks like to begin closing this gap, because abstract encouragement is not very useful when you are sitting in the middle of a life that feels misaligned. The first step is simply to name the gap. Not to fix it, not to make a dramatic change, but to say honestly, even if only to yourself, that there is a distance between the life you are living and the life you want. That act of honest naming is powerful because it interrupts the script's demand that you pretend everything is fine. The second step is to get curious about what is on the other side of the gap. What would you do differently if approval were not a factor? What would you stop doing? What would you start? What conversations would you finally have? These questions are meant to reconnect you with a part of yourself that the script has kept quiet, sometimes for so long that its voice has become a whisper. I find it useful to frame this as an experiment rather than a commitment. You do not need to know the answers with certainty. You just need to be willing to wonder. Wondering is itself a radical act for a woman who has spent her life executing rather than reflecting. It creates a tiny opening between stimulus and response, between the expectation and the automatic compliance. And in that opening, something genuine can begin to emerge, something that belongs to you rather than to the script. The third step, which we will explore more deeply in later chapters, particularly through the Map of a New Life exercise in Chapter 7, is to begin making small, deliberate choices that align more closely with what you discover. Not a revolution, not a dismantling of your entire life, just one choice at a time, made with awareness rather than on autopilot. The gap between expectations and reality is not a sign that you have failed. It is a sign that you have outgrown a formula that was never designed to serve you in the first place. And the courage to see that clearly is the beginning of writing your own script.
By the way, it would be interesting to know your opinion. Do you agree with the author's point of view? If you agree with this idea, write the word "agree" in the comments.
Chapter 5. To Give Without Losing. Motherhood and Female Self-Worth. Of all the roles that activate the good girl script, motherhood may be the most powerful. It is the role where self-sacrifice is most thoroughly sanctified, where guilt is most easily triggered, and where the pressure to disappear into someone else's needs is presented not just as acceptable, but as morally required. Let me be clear at the outset. I am not arguing against devoted parenting. I am a mother myself, and the love I feel for my children is among the most genuine things in my life. What I am arguing against is the specific myth that tells a woman she must dissolve her own identity to be a good mother. This myth does not serve children, it does not serve families, and it certainly does not serve the women who live by it. The myth of the ideal mother has a long cultural history, but its modern form is particularly demanding. Today's good mother is expected to be simultaneously nurturing and stimulating, present and productive, emotionally attuned and endlessly patient. She should manage the logistics of daily life: meals, schedules, appointments, school communications, extracurricular activities, and social relationships, while also providing the kind of deep emotional engagement that child development experts recommend. She should do all of this while maintaining her career, her marriage, her friendships, her health, and, if she has time left over, some version of her own interests. The expectations are not merely high, they are contradictory, and no single person can fulfill all of them simultaneously. The impossibility of this standard is obvious when you spell it out, and yet millions of women measure themselves against it every day and find themselves falling short. The guilt this produces is not mild or occasional. In my clinical experience, maternal guilt is one of the most corrosive emotions a woman can carry, because it attacks her sense of adequacy in the role she has been taught matters most. I remember a period when my children were young when I agreed to every school volunteer request, attended every event, prepared elaborate meals, managed every detail of the household, and maintained my professional responsibilities. I was determined to prove that motherhood and career could coexist without anything being compromised. What was actually being compromised, of course, was me. I was not sleeping enough, not exercising, not seeing friends, and not doing anything that existed solely for my own pleasure or restoration. I had become a function rather than a person, a system for managing other people's needs that happened to have a body. The turning point came during a routine medical appointment when my doctor, noting my weight loss and fatigue, asked me a question that stopped me cold. "When was the last time you did something just for yourself?" I could not answer, not because I could not remember the specific date, but because the concept of doing something just for myself had been so thoroughly expelled from my operating system that the question barely made sense. My internal response was something like, "Why would I do something just for myself when there are people who need me?" It was the same logic I described in the introduction, the script running so deep that even a direct question could not reach beneath it. This is what the ideal mother myth does at its deepest level. It does not just add pressure, it removes the category of self-care from a woman's mental framework. Her needs become invisible to her, not because she is selfless in some admirable way, but because she has internalized a belief that her needs should not exist. And when needs are invisible, they do not disappear. They metastasize into resentment, exhaustion, depression, and physical illness. The research on this is consistent and unambiguous. Mothers who maintain their own identity, interest, and self-care practices are not less effective parents. They are more effective ones. Isabel Roscom and colleagues in their large-scale research on parental burnout found that depleted mothers show measurably lower warmth and higher emotional withdrawal from their children, the exact opposite of what the sacrifice myth promises. Children benefit from having a mother who is present and emotionally regulated, and emotional regulation requires that a woman's own needs are being met. A mother running on empty is not giving her best to anyone, including her children. She is giving them whatever is left after everything else has been depleted, and what is left is often irritability, emotional distance, or tired compliance rather than the warm, attuned presence that children actually need. There is also a modeling effect that is easy to overlook. Children are astute observers of their parents' behavior, far more so than most adults realize. A daughter who watches her mother consistently ignore her own needs, suppress her opinions, and sacrifice her well-being, without limit does not learn that her mother is heroic. She learns that this is what women do. She learns that a woman's needs are less important than everyone else's. She absorbs the same script that her mother absorbed, and the cycle continues into the next generation. One of the most powerful things a mother can do for her daughter is to demonstrate, through her own behavior, that a woman's life has value beyond service to others. In the context of motherhood, the script becomes particularly destructive. It frames any attention a mother pays to herself as attention stolen from her children. It creates a zero-sum equation where the only way to be a good mother is to be a depleted woman. And it reinforces this equation with guilt, the script's most reliable enforcement mechanism. Every time you take an hour for yourself, the alarm sounds. You are being selfish, you are neglecting your children, you are not measuring up. What changes look like in practice? Breaking this equation requires rethinking what good motherhood actually means. It means recognizing that a mother is a person first, not a role. It means understanding that children learn more from watching how their mother treats herself than from any deliberate lesson she teaches them. A mother who respects her own boundaries, pursues her own interests, and takes care of her own health is teaching her children something invaluable, that every person's needs matter, including their own. In practical terms, this means several things. It means delegating tasks and responsibilities instead of assuming you must handle everything yourself. In my case, learning to delegate was one of the most difficult and most transformative changes I made. I had to confront the belief that no one could do things as well as I could, and the deeper belief beneath it, which was that asking for help meant I was failing at the role I was supposed to perform perfectly. Delegation is not just a practical strategy, it is a psychological one. Every time you hand off a task and allow it to be done imperfectly without intervening, you weaken the belief that your worth depends on doing everything yourself. You also give the people around you, your partner, your older children, your extended family, the opportunity to contribute meaningfully, which benefits them as much as it benefits you. Many women discover that their reluctance to delegate is not just about maintaining standards. It is about maintaining the identity of being indispensable, because indispensability feels like the safest guarantee of being loved. It also means establishing and maintaining boundaries around your time. Not all of your time belongs to your family. Some of it belongs to you, and protecting that time is not selfish. It is structurally necessary for your well-being, which in turn is structurally necessary for your family's well-being. It means accepting that the house will sometimes be messy, that meals will sometimes be simple, that your children will sometimes be bored or frustrated, and that none of these things constitute evidence of bad parenting. I have found that women often need explicit permission to lower the standard, not because they are incapable of thinking this through themselves, but because the pressure to maintain impossibly high standards in motherhood is so relentless that any deviation triggers the guilt response. So let me say it plainly. Your children do not need a perfect mother. They need a present one. Present means you can look at them without mentally sorting tomorrow's logistics. And you cannot be present if you are running on fumes, counting the minutes until bedtime, and quietly resenting the life you built because it left no room for you. Your imperfect, honest, boundaried presence is worth more to your children than your exhausted, resentful perfection. I also want to address the guilt directly, because for many women, understanding the problem intellectually does not stop the guilt from arriving on schedule. Guilt is the script's alarm system. Every time you prioritize yourself, the alarm activates. Recognize this alarm for what it is, a conditioned response, not a moral truth. The guilt you feel when you take an evening for yourself is not evidence that you are doing something wrong. It is evidence that the old program is running. Over time, with practice and repetition, the alarm gets quieter. Not because you become callous, but because you accumulate evidence that contradicts the script. You take time off, and your children are fine. You stop volunteering for every activity, and your children still thrive. You ask your partner to handle bedtime, and the family does not collapse. Each piece of evidence weakens the script's hold and strengthens your confidence in a new truth, that you can be a loving, devoted mother and a whole person at the same time. These identities are not in competition. They depend on each other. Chapter 6. Doom or Choice, when a woman does not believe in her strength. There is a state of mind that I encounter frequently in my work, and it is one of the most painful to witness. It is the deep, quiet conviction that nothing can change, a settled belief that the conditions of one's life are fixed, that effort is futile, and that the only option is to endure whatever comes. Women describe this state in different ways. I've tried everything. This is just how it is. I don't have the energy anymore. Maybe I'm just not the kind of person who gets to have that. These statements are not lazy or defeatist. They are the voice of a particular kind of exhaustion, the exhaustion that comes from trying for years within a system that was never designed to reward your efforts fairly. And they deserve to be taken seriously, not dismissed with cheerful slogans. In psychology, this state has a well-researched name: learned helplessness. The concept originated in 1967 when Martin Seligman and Stephen Meyer conducted experiments in which dogs were exposed to electric shocks they could not escape. When later placed in a situation where escape was possible, the dogs did not try. They had learned that their actions made no difference, and that conclusion persisted even after the conditions changed. Seligman and subsequent researchers extended the finding to humans, demonstrating that repeated exposure to uncontrollable negative outcomes produces a generalized belief: my actions do not matter. For women trapped in the good girl script, learned helplessness does not usually develop from a single dramatic event. It builds gradually, from the accumulation of smaller experiences over years. You advocate for yourself at work, and nothing changes. You express a need in your relationship, and it is dismissed or forgotten. You set a boundary with a family member, and it is violated repeatedly. You ask for help, and the help never materializes or comes with so many strings attached that it is not worth accepting. Each of these experiences, individually, might be manageable, but over time they teach a consistent lesson: your voice does not produce results. And once that lesson takes hold, the natural response is to stop using your voice. This is the mechanism that transforms disappointment into resignation. And resignation, once established, can feel remarkably like reality. The woman who believes she cannot change her circumstances is not being irrational from her own perspective. She has years of evidence to support her conclusion. The problem is that the evidence is misleading because it was collected under conditions that were specifically designed to produce compliance rather than agency. Let me explain what I mean by that. The good girl script teaches women to seek change through indirect means, through patience, through being good enough, through hoping that others will notice and respond. These are precisely the strategies most likely to fail because they depend entirely on other people's choices and willingness to change. When a woman's only tools for change are tools that rely on others' cooperation, failure is almost guaranteed, and the resulting sense of helplessness feels logical and inevitable. Learned helplessness in women is not simply a psychological problem to be solved with better thinking. It is a structural problem. The script produces the very conditions that lead to helplessness, and then the helplessness reinforces the script. If you believe you cannot change anything, you stop trying to change anything, which means the script continues to run unchallenged, which confirms the belief that nothing can change. It is a closed loop, and breaking it requires a very specific kind of intervention. That intervention is not motivation. I want to be direct about this because much of the popular advice given to women in this state amounts to cheerful encouragement. You're stronger than you think. You can do anything you set your mind to. This advice is not only unhelpful, it can actually be harmful because it implies that the only thing standing between a woman and a different life is her attitude. It places the blame for structural and psychological constraints on the individual's mindset, which is just another form of the script's demand that she try harder and feel less. What does help is a much more modest and more powerful process. It begins with awareness, moves through understanding, and leads to action, but action of a very specific kind that does not require prior confidence or certainty. The awareness step involves recognizing the state of helplessness for what it is, a learned response, not an accurate assessment of reality. The recognition is harder than it sounds. When you have believed for years that you cannot change your circumstances, that belief feels like a fact. It does not feel like a conclusion you reached through experience. It feels like the way things are. Seeing it as a learned response requires stepping back far enough to observe the pattern, which is difficult to do when you are inside it. One technique I use with clients is what I call evidence mapping. I ask them to describe a specific situation they feel helpless to change, and then to list every strategy they have tried. Almost invariably, the strategies cluster around the same category: indirect approaches, hinting, hoping, enduring, accommodating, being patient, dropping clues, and waiting for them to be noticed. When I point out that they have not actually tried direct approaches, like clearly stating their needs, enforcing consequences when boundaries are crossed, or making unilateral decisions about their own lives, the response is often surprise followed by recognition. They had not tried everything. They had tried the same category of thing many times. This recognition is the bridge between awareness and understanding. The understanding step involves grasping why the indirect strategies were the only ones that felt available. The answer, of course, leads back to the script. Direct strategies, asserting needs, enforcing boundaries, making independent choices, were coded as dangerous from childhood onward. They risked rejection, conflict, or the loss of love. The indirect strategies felt safer because they were safer within the logic of the script. They maintained the relationship, preserved the image, and kept the peace. They just did not actually solve anything. Once this dynamic is clearly understood, action becomes possible. Not because the woman has been motivated or inspired, but because she can finally see a new category of options that was previously invisible to her. The action step does not begin with grand gestures or life overhauls. It begins with what I call micro-assertions, small, concrete acts that exercise the capacity for direct agency. A micro-assertion might be saying no to a request without offering an elaborate explanation or apology. It might be stating a preference in a situation where you would normally defer to someone else. It might be making a decision about your own time without consulting everyone who might be affected. It might be allowing a conflict to exist for a few hours without rushing to resolve it. These actions are deliberately small because the goal is not to transform your life in a single moment. The goal is to generate new evidence, one experience at a time. Every time you take a direct action and the world does not end, you weaken the learned helplessness and strengthen a new belief. My actions can produce results. I should acknowledge that this process is not smooth or comfortable. The first micro-assertions often trigger intense anxiety, guilt, or fear of backlash. The good girl alarm system activates immediately. You are being selfish. You are causing conflict. People will not like you. Something terrible will happen. These reactions are expected and normal. They are the script's defense mechanisms, activated precisely because the script is being challenged for the first time. The critical principle is to act despite the discomfort rather than waiting until the discomfort disappears. If you wait to feel confident before asserting yourself, you will wait forever. Because confidence in this domain is a result of action, not a prerequisite for it. You do the thing that frightens you. The fear decreases slightly. Your confidence builds incrementally. You do the next thing. This is how learned helplessness is unlearned, not through positive thinking or belief, but through behavioral evidence accumulated one small step at a time. I want to share something I observed in a client I worked with for over a year. She began with micro-assertions so small they might seem trivial, telling her husband what she wanted for dinner, instead of asking what he preferred, declining one optional work meeting per week, spending Saturday mornings reading instead of cleaning. Within 3 months, these small acts had shifted something fundamental in how she experienced herself. She began to see herself as someone whose preferences mattered, someone who could make choices and survive the consequences. By the end of the year, she had renegotiated her work hours, had an honest conversation with her mother about boundaries, and enrolled in a course she had been postponing for a decade. None of these changes began with a dramatic resolution. They began with choosing what to eat for dinner. That is the nature of micro-assertions. Each one is small enough to feel manageable, but the cumulative effect is a fundamentally different relationship with your own agency. The shift from helplessness to agency also requires examining one more concept that the script has badly distorted: the difference between responsibility and control. The good girl script tends to blur these two concepts dangerously. It teaches women that they are responsible for everything, including other people's feelings, other people's happiness, the smooth functioning of every system they are part of, and the emotional well-being of everyone around them, while simultaneously giving them very little actual control over any of these outcomes. Personal responsibility, in its healthy and useful form, means something much more focused. It means being accountable for your own choices, your own behavior, and your own life. It does not mean managing everyone else's emotional experience. It does not mean preventing all conflict. It does not mean ensuring that no one is ever disappointed or inconvenienced by your decisions. When you clarify this distinction, something liberating happens. The scope of what you are responsible for shrinks to a manageable size, and within that scope, you discover you have real, tangible agency. I want you to sit with the following 3 statements. Read each pair slowly and notice which half you have been living in. You cannot control whether your partner changes the behaviors that hurt you. You can control whether you stay in a relationship that is not meeting your needs. You cannot control whether your employer values your contributions. You can control whether you continue working somewhere that does not. You cannot control whether your family approves of your choices. You can control whether you make those choices anyway. This is the shift from doom to choice. Not from helplessness to omnipotence, but from the belief that nothing is possible to the recognition that some things are possible, specifically the things that fall within the boundaries of your own decisions and actions. That recognition is not a small thing. For a woman who has spent years believing that she is trapped, the discovery that she has choices, real, concrete, actionable choices, can feel like stepping out of a dark room into daylight. It does not mean every choice is easy. It does not mean the consequences are always pleasant. It does not mean the fear and guilt disappear. It means that you are no longer operating on the assumption that your actions do not matter. And once that assumption is gone, everything changes, not all at once, but steadily, irreversibly, one deliberate choice at a time. The first 2 parts of this book asked you to see. What follows is about doing, the practical, sometimes uncomfortable, often liberating work of building a life that is actually yours. Part 3. How to stop being a good girl and start living for yourself. Chapter 7. A new identity. Who am I if not a good girl? There comes a moment in this process, usually after the recognition described in the previous chapters, when something unexpected happens. You have seen the script. You understand where it came from. You have felt the cost of following it. You may even have begun to make small changes, saying no here, setting a boundary there. And then, in a quiet moment, a question surfaces that is more disorienting than anything that came before. If I am not the good girl, who am I? This question is not philosophical. It is visceral. When you have built your identity around being reliable, accommodating, selfless, and agreeable, removing those qualities does not feel like liberation. It feels like demolition. You are not adding something new to a stable structure. You are pulling out load-bearing walls, and the entire building shakes. I want to name this experience clearly because many women abandon the process at exactly this point. They feel the instability, interpret it as evidence that they are making a mistake, and retreat back into the familiar role. The discomfort of not knowing who you are feels worse in the moment than the slow suffocation of being someone you are not. This is understandable, but it is also the precise point where the most important work happens. In psychology, this kind of transitional state has been studied under various frameworks. William Bridges, writing about life transitions, distinguished between change and transition. Change is the external event, the new job, the ended relationship, the decision to stop playing a role. Transition is the internal psychological process that accompanies it, and it always involves a period he called the neutral zone, a disorienting space between the old identity and the new one. The neutral zone is not a failure of the process. It is the process. What does this zone feel like in practice? Women I have worked with describe it in remarkably similar terms. There is a sense of emptiness where the old certainties used to be. There is confusion about preferences that used to seem automatic. A client told me she stood in a bookstore for 20 minutes, unable to choose a novel, because she realized she had spent years reading only what her book club selected, and she had no idea what she actually liked. The old filtering system, will this impress someone? Is this what a smart woman reads, had been switched off, and nothing had yet replaced it. These experiences, though uncomfortable, are signs of progress. The emptiness is not a void, it is a clearing. The old programs, the automatic reactions, the reflexive compliance have been interrupted, and what remains is a silence that many women have never experienced. It is the silence of not performing, and it can feel terrifying precisely because it is so unfamiliar. It is also important to understand that the neutral zone does not follow a neat timeline. For some women, it lasts weeks. For others, months or even longer. The temptation to rush through it, to quickly assemble a new identity and move on, is strong but counterproductive. A new identity that is assembled too quickly is often just another performance, a more sophisticated version of the old script dressed in the language of authenticity. Real change takes time because it involves not just thinking differently, but feeling differently, and feelings do not change on command. They shift gradually as new experiences accumulate and new neural pathways form. The rebuilding that follows is not a single dramatic act of reinvention. It is a slow process of noticing, testing, and integrating. You begin to pay attention to small signals that the script used to override. What do I actually enjoy? Not what should I enjoy, or what would impress other people, or what would make me a more interesting person, but what genuinely engages me when no one is watching. What makes me lose track of time? What topics light up my thinking? What activities leave me feeling more alive, rather than more depleted? These questions sound simple, but for a woman who has spent decades attuned to everyone else's signals, tuning into her own can feel like learning a new language. The signals are faint at first because they have been suppressed for so long, a flicker of interest in something unexpected, a moment of genuine laughter, a physical sensation of relaxation in a particular setting. These are the raw materials of authentic identity, and they cannot be manufactured through willpower or decision. They can only be noticed, respected, and gradually built upon. The process also involves learning to tolerate other people's reactions to your changes. When you stop performing the role of the good girl, the people who benefited from that performance will notice. Some will be supportive, others will be confused or even hostile. A partner who was accustomed to your automatic agreement may interpret your new preferences as rejection. A parent who relied on your compliance may express hurt or anger. A colleague who counted on your willingness to take on extra work may call you selfish. These reactions are not evidence that you are doing something wrong. They are evidence that the system is adjusting to a new reality. Here is a tool I have found useful both personally and with clients. I call it the map of a new life. It is not a vision board or a goal-setting exercise. It is a structured inquiry into the life you would build if the script were no longer running your decisions. I will walk you through it as 3 questions, each one building on the last. The first question: what am I currently doing out of obligation, habit, or the desire for approval? Take your time with this. Think about your daily and weekly routines, your commitments, the favors you automatically agree to, the roles you fill without being asked. Write down everything that comes to mind. The second question: of those things, what would I stop doing if there were no social consequences? If no one would judge you, be disappointed, or think less of you, what would you put down? The third question: what would I begin doing if fear and guilt were not factors? What have you been postponing, dismissing, or talking yourself out of? What has been waiting quietly in the background of your life for permission to exist? The power of this exercise is not in the lists themselves, but in what they reveal about the distance between your current life and your desired one. Most women find that the gap is not as vast as they feared. They do not want to abandon their families, quit their jobs, or move to a different country. They want smaller but deeply meaningful changes, more time for themselves, more honesty in their relationships, more alignment between their values and their daily choices. These are not selfish desires. They are the basic requirements of a life lived with integrity. Building a new identity is not about becoming someone different. It is about becoming someone more complete. The kindness, the capacity for care, the ability to consider others. These qualities do not disappear when the script is removed. They become more genuine because they are offered from choice rather than from compulsion. The woman who emerges from this process is not less kind than the good girl. She is more honest. And honesty, as it turns out, is a much stronger foundation for identity than performance ever was. The good girl was a character you played. The person you are becoming is someone you are discovering, and discovery, unlike performance, never runs out of room. Chapter 8. The Skill of Saying No. Of all the skills involved in stepping out of the good girl script, learning to say no is perhaps the most fundamental and the most feared. It is fundamental because every boundary, every act of self-respect, every authentic choice ultimately rests on the ability to decline what does not serve you. And it is feared because the script has spent a lifetime teaching you that refusal equals rejection, that saying no to someone means losing their love or respect. Let me begin with what no actually is, because the script distorts it so thoroughly that many women have lost sight of its real nature. No is a statement of limit. It says, "This is where my capacity ends. This is what I am willing to do. This is what I am not." Every human being has limits. The only question is whether you acknowledge yours honestly or pretend they do not exist until your body or your mind forces the issue. And the body does force the issue, eventually. In my clinical practice, I have observed a consistent pattern. Women who cannot say no verbally often begin saying it somatically. Chronic headaches, back pain, digestive problems, insomnia, unexplained fatigue. These are the body's way of refusing what the mind will not. The body registers what the mind refuses to acknowledge, and it is far less diplomatic about expressing it. When a woman overrides her limits repeatedly, the body will eventually override her. I experienced this myself during a period when I was accepting every professional invitation, every favor requested by friends, every additional responsibility at home. I developed persistent neck and shoulder pain that no amount of physical therapy could resolve. It was only when I began examining what I was carrying emotionally, and more importantly, what I could put down, that the pain started to ease. Within weeks of declining 3 standing commitments I had been resenting for months, the tension released in a way no massage or stretching routine had managed. My body had been saying no on my behalf because I refused to say it myself. The fear that drives the inability to say no is almost always the same fear at its root, the fear of other people's negative emotions. If I say no, they will be disappointed. If I say no, they will be angry. If I say no, they will think less of me. If I say no, they will leave. This fear is entirely understandable given the script's conditioning. From childhood, the good girl learned that other people's emotional states are her responsibility. If someone is unhappy, it must be because she failed at her job of keeping everyone comfortable. But the script conceals something fundamental. Other people's emotions are not your responsibility. They are your concern, certainly, if you care about the person. But concern is not the same as responsibility. You can care about someone's feelings without accepting the obligation to prevent them from ever feeling disappointed or frustrated. In fact, trying to prevent all negative emotions in the people around you is not kindness. It is control, driven by the need to manage your own anxiety about their reactions. This point is worth sitting with because it is often the hardest for women raised on the script to accept. If someone is upset because you said no and you feel responsible for their upset, then every refusal becomes an act of harm. But if you can see their upset as their emotional response to a boundary, one they are capable of managing without your intervention, then refusal becomes something much more neutral. It becomes a healthy transaction between two adults, each of whom is responsible for their own emotional regulation. Learning to say no is really learning to tolerate other people's discomfort without rushing to fix it. This is a skill, and like all skills, it develops with practice and deteriorates with avoidance. The first few refusals will feel terrible. Your heart will race. You will want to immediately retract, to apologize, to offer an alternative that gives the other person what they wanted after all. This is the script's alarm system, and as we discussed in Chapter 6, the only way to deactivate it is to let it ring without obeying it. In practical terms, effective refusal does not require elaborate justification. One of the most common mistakes women make when they begin saying no is over-explaining. They provide lengthy reasons, cite external circumstances, apologize profusely, and essentially ask for permission to refuse. This approach undermines the refusal itself because it communicates that you do not believe you have the right to decline without a sufficiently compelling excuse. A clear, respectful no sounds simpler than most people expect. I'm not able to take that on right now. That doesn't work for me. I've thought about it and I'm going to pass. These are complete sentences. They do not require a supporting argument. They do not require an apology. They do not require an alternative offer. The urge to add all of those things is the script talking, and resisting that urge is part of the practice. Let me be specific about how this works in different contexts, because each one has its own dynamics. In the workplace, saying no often feels most dangerous because of the real or perceived power imbalance. A useful strategy here is what I call the priority redirect. Instead of simply declining a request, you frame the refusal in terms of competing priorities. I can take on this project, but it would mean delaying the report you asked for last week. Which would you prefer I prioritize? This approach protects the boundary while demonstrating professionalism and competence rather than defiance. In family relationships, where the emotional stakes are highest, saying no often triggers the deepest guilt. A mother who declines her sister's request to host a family gathering may feel as though she has violated a sacred obligation. A daughter who tells her parents she will not be visiting this holiday may feel she is committing an act of betrayal. These feelings are the script's enforcement mechanism, and they are disproportionate to the actual significance of the refusal. Recognizing the disproportion is itself an important act of awareness. In personal relationships and friendships, the challenge is often that saying no feels like it will damage intimacy. But the opposite is true. A relationship built on automatic agreement is a relationship built on a performance. Neither person is actually known by the other because one of them is never honestly present. When you begin saying no in a close relationship, you create the conditions for genuine connection because you are finally showing up as yourself rather than as a carefully managed version of yourself. The other person may initially be startled by the change, but if the relationship has any real depth, it will adapt and ultimately grow stronger for the honesty. I remember the first time I told a close friend that I could not help her with a project she had assumed I would handle. The silence on the phone lasted several seconds, and in those seconds, every alarm in my system fired. She was going to be hurt. She was going to pull away. The friendship was going to suffer. What actually happened was that she paused, said, "Okay, I understand," and called someone else. The friendship did not change, except that I respected myself slightly more within it. That small increase in self-respect, multiplied across dozens of similar moments over months and years, is what transforms the relationship you have with yourself. It does not happen through grand declarations. It happens through the quiet, repeated practice of honoring your own limits. Chapter 9: Establishing Personal Boundaries in Relationships, Family, and Work. If saying no is the foundational skill, then establishing boundaries is the architecture you build with that skill. A boundary is closer to a property line than a barricade. It defines what is yours without preventing anyone from existing on the other side. It communicates where you end and another person begins, what you are willing to accept, what you are not, and what happens when those limits are crossed. This distinction matters because many women who grew up with the good girl script have a deeply distorted understanding of what boundaries are. They associate boundaries with conflict, with coldness, with pushing people away. In reality, boundaries are what make genuine closeness possible. Without them, relationships devolve into patterns of resentment, manipulation, and emotional exhaustion. With them, each person can show up honestly, knowing where they stand and what is expected. Let me address the 3 primary domains where boundary work is most needed, beginning with romantic partnerships. In intimate relationships, the absence of boundaries often masquerades as love. The woman who answers every text immediately, who rearranges her schedule around her partner's preferences, who suppresses her opinions to avoid disagreement, may believe she is being a devoted partner. What she is actually doing is erasing herself from the relationship and hoping her partner will somehow love the absence she has become. Healthy boundaries in a partnership look different than most people expect. They include the freedom to have different opinions without it becoming a crisis. They include the right to spend time alone or with friends without providing a detailed justification. They include the expectation that household labor and emotional labor will be distributed fairly, not just promised fairly. And they include the ability to say, "This is not acceptable to me," without it being treated as an act of betrayal. Boundaries in a healthy relationship do not diminish love. They define the shape of the container that holds it, and without a container, love spills everywhere and nourishes nothing. When I began reestablishing boundaries in my own marriage, the process was not smooth. My partner had grown accustomed to a dynamic where my needs were invisible, and his preferences organized our shared life. When I started expressing what I wanted, honestly and directly, there was a period of friction that felt alarming. I interpreted the friction as evidence that I was damaging the relationship. In hindsight, the friction was the relationship reorganizing itself around a more honest foundation. The discomfort was temporary. The improvement was lasting. Our connection became deeper, not because I became more accommodating, but because I became more real. I should say here that my marriage survived this process and grew stronger for it. Not all relationships do. I have worked with women whose partners could not or would not adapt to the presence of a woman with boundaries where a compliant caretaker used to be. That outcome is painful, and I do not minimize it, but it is also clarifying. A relationship that can only function when one person has no boundaries was never a partnership. It was an arrangement, and one that was costing you far more than you were receiving. Family boundaries present a different set of challenges, primarily because family systems have had decades to solidify their patterns. The role you were assigned in your family of origin, whether it was the peacemaker, the responsible one, the caretaker, or the one who never causes trouble, has enormous inertia behind it. When you attempt to change your role, the system often pushes back, sometimes aggressively, because your change threatens the stability of the entire structure. A family is an ecosystem, and when one member changes her behavior, every other member feels the effects. Understanding the resistance is context for navigating it, not a reason to retreat. A common pattern I see in my practice is what I call the guilt negotiation. A woman sets a boundary with a parent or sibling, perhaps declining to host a holiday, or refusing to mediate a family conflict, or limiting the frequency of phone calls. The family member responds with guilt rather than direct anger. "After everything I've done for you, I guess I'm not important to you anymore. Your sister would never do this." These responses are designed, consciously or not, to make the boundary feel like a moral failing rather than a reasonable limit. Recognizing this pattern is essential because guilt negotiation only works if you accept the premise that your family's comfort is more important than your own well-being. The workplace presents its own boundary challenges, many of which are structural rather than purely interpersonal. In many organizational cultures, the expectation of constant availability, of being a team player who never declines additional work, is built into the fabric of the environment. Setting boundaries at work often requires navigating not just individual relationships, but institutional norms that reward overfunctioning and penalize self-preservation. A woman who leaves at 5 o'clock when everyone else stays until 7 is making a boundary decision, and in some workplaces, that decision carries real professional risk. This is worth acknowledging honestly. Boundary setting is not without cost, and pretending otherwise would be dishonest. The question is not whether there is a cost, but whether the cost of not having the boundary is higher. A practical approach I recommend is what I call the boundary statement, a clear, non-aggressive articulation of a limit. It has 3 components. First, you name the situation. When meetings are scheduled after 6 o'clock in the evening. Second, you state your position. I am not available for those meetings. Third, you offer a constructive alternative if appropriate. I can review the notes and contribute my input the following morning. This structure keeps the communication focused on behavior and logistics rather than emotion and justification. There are several common mistakes that women tend to make when they first begin setting boundaries, and naming them may help you avoid or recover from them. The first is over-explaining. As with saying no, the urge to justify a boundary with extensive reasoning is a sign that the script is still running. A boundary does not require a legal brief. It requires clarity. The second mistake is setting a boundary and then immediately abandoning it when the other person reacts negatively. This pattern teaches the people around you that your boundaries are negotiable, which means they will test them every time. Consistency is more important than perfection. You do not need to set every boundary flawlessly. You need to hold the ones you set. The third mistake is confusing a boundary with a demand for someone else to change. A boundary defines your behavior, not someone else's. You cannot set a boundary that says, "My partner must stop criticizing me." You can set a boundary that says, "When my partner criticizes me, I will leave the room and resume the conversation when it can be conducted respectfully." The distinction is crucial. You control what you do. You do not control what others do. But what you do in response to what others do is entirely within your authority. This is the practical application of the principle we explored in Chapter 6, distinguishing between responsibility and control. Your boundaries are expressions of your responsibility for yourself, not attempts to control anyone else. I have watched hundreds of women move through the process of establishing boundaries, and the pattern is remarkably consistent. There is initial fear, then the discomfort of enforcing the boundary, then the surprise when the consequences are less catastrophic than expected, and finally, a growing sense of solidity and self-respect that becomes its own reward. The relationships that survive the introduction of boundaries become stronger and more honest. The relationships that do not survive were built on your willingness to disappear, and their loss, though painful, is ultimately a gain. Grieving those relationships is legitimate and sometimes necessary, but what you are left with when the dust settles are connections that are based on who you actually are rather than on who you were willing to pretend to be. And those connections, fewer though they may be, are worth more than 100 relationships sustained by your erasure. You now have the tools for the immediate work, recognizing scripts, rebuilding identity, saying no, setting boundaries. Part 4 addresses the deeper terrain, the inner structures of self-worth, the relationship with money, and the ancient fear of being alone. Part 4. How to build a life by your own rules. Chapter 10. self-esteem, and self-confidence. Throughout this book, we have been examining the structures that shape a woman's life from the outside: childhood conditioning, cultural scripts, social expectations, institutional pressures. But there is an internal structure that holds all of these in place, and without addressing it, no amount of boundary setting or script recognition will produce lasting change. That structure is self-esteem. Self-esteem, as it is commonly understood, refers to how a person evaluates their own worth. But for women raised under the good girl script, self-esteem takes a particular and problematic form. It becomes conditional. It depends not on an internal sense of inherent value, but on external signals: praise, approval, achievement, usefulness. When those signals are present, self-esteem is high. When they are absent, self-esteem collapses. This creates a dependency that operates with the same compulsive logic as any habit you cannot stop on your own. The mechanism is straightforward. From childhood, a girl learns that she is valued when she is good, which is to say, when she is useful, pleasant, and compliant. This teaches her that her worth is not intrinsic. It is earned, and it must be re-earned constantly through performance. As an adult, this translates into a relentless need for confirmation. A good performance review feels like temporary proof of worth. A critical comment feels like evidence of worthlessness. The woman's inner experience of herself swings with every external signal, and she has no stable ground to stand on. I want to distinguish this from healthy responsiveness to feedback. Every mature adult adjusts their behavior based on the responses they receive from the world. That is not the problem. The problem is when external feedback is the only source of information about your value. When your sense of worth has no internal foundation, you are at the mercy of every person's mood, every performance outcome, every social interaction. You cannot afford to fail, because failure does not feel like a setback. It feels like an annihilation of self. Building genuine self-esteem requires shifting from what I call the earned model to what I call the grounded model. These are terms I developed in my clinical work to help women see two fundamentally different operating systems running beneath their daily experience. In the earned model, you are worth what you produce. In the grounded model, you are worth something simply because you exist, and what you produce is a separate matter entirely. The distinction is functional, not sentimental. It changes how you process information about yourself. The earned model keeps you on a treadmill that never stops, because there is always another performance to deliver, another person to impress, another standard to meet. The grounded model gives you a place to stand that does not move every time the external conditions change. Making this shift is genuinely difficult, and I want to be honest about that. You cannot simply decide to have unconditional self-worth and have it appear overnight. The conditional model has been reinforced for decades, and it has deep roots in your neural circuitry, but it can be weakened gradually through a specific kind of attention and practice. The practical method I use with clients to facilitate this shift is what I call the I am worthy practice. It is not an affirmation exercise in the traditional sense. It is a structured process of noticing and interrupting the conditional patterns. Let me walk you through how it works. You begin by paying attention throughout your ordinary day to the moments when your sense of worth fluctuates. Someone compliments you, and you feel a surge of value. Someone criticizes you, and you feel diminished. You complete a task well, and you feel adequate. You make a mistake, and you feel exposed. Each of these fluctuations is a signal that the conditional model is operating. When you notice a fluctuation, pause. Then ask yourself two questions, in this order. First, what just happened externally? Describe the event simply as a journalist would. Second, what story am I now telling myself about my worth based on what happened? Name the story as specifically as you can. The gap between the external event and the internal story is where the work lives. The external event is just an event. The story, This means I am not good enough, or this proves I am valuable, is the script interpreting the event through its own framework. Once you can see that gap clearly, you have a choice you did not have before. You can let the story run, or you can set it down. Over time, with repeated practice, you begin to see the stories for what they are: interpretations, not facts. And as the stories lose their automatic authority, something quieter and more stable emerges underneath. It is not euphoria or unshakable confidence. It is something more modest and more useful, a settled awareness that your worth is not on the table in every interaction. You can fail without being a failure. You can be criticized without being diminished. You can be imperfect and still be enough. I also want to note something that is often misunderstood about self-esteem work. Building a grounded sense of worth does not mean you stop caring about quality or stop striving for excellence. It means you decouple your identity from your output. You can still want to do excellent work. You can still feel disappointed when something falls short. But the disappointment stays proportional to the event rather than spiraling into a crisis of identity. You failed at a task, not at being a person. That distinction, simple as it sounds, changes the emotional landscape of your entire life. My own relationship with self-esteem followed this trajectory. For years, my sense of worth was entirely tethered to my professional performance. A successful lecture made me feel valid. A rejected paper made me feel worthless. The swings were exhausting, and they made it impossible to take creative risks because every risk carried the potential for a collapse in self-worth. It was only when I began to separate my value as a person from my output as a professional that I gained the stability to actually do better work. The paradox is real. When your worth no longer depends on your performance often improves because you are no longer crippled by the fear of what failure would mean about you. Self-esteem is not built by accumulating more achievements or more approval. It is built by developing an internal relationship with yourself that does not require constant external reinforcement. This is patient, ongoing work. It is not accomplished by reading a chapter or completing an exercise. But every moment of awareness, every time you catch the conditional pattern and choose not to believe it, strengthens the new foundation. And over time, that foundation becomes solid enough to hold you, not because the world approves, but because you do. This is perhaps the most radical act available to a woman raised on the good girl script. Deciding that her own approval matters, that her own assessment of herself counts, and that she does not need anyone else's permission to believe she is enough. Chapter 11. Work, Money, and Ambition. There is a particular silence that falls over many women when the subject of money arises, the silence of discomfort, of something that feels transgressive or unseemly. This silence is not accidental. It is trained. From childhood, many women absorb the message that talking about money, wanting money, and valuing their work in financial terms is somehow unfeminine, aggressive, or greedy. These attitudes operate quietly but powerfully, shaping career decisions, salary negotiations, pricing structures, and overall financial trajectories in ways that most women do not fully recognize. The good girl script has a specific and damaging relationship with money. It teaches that virtue lies in selflessness, and selflessness is fundamentally incompatible with financial ambition. If your value comes from what you give rather than what you earn, then earning feels like a betrayal of your identity. Asking for a raise feels like asking for something you do not deserve. Charging full price for your services feels greedy. Wanting more feels like wanting too much. I see the consequences of these attitudes in my practice regularly. One client, a corporate communications consultant I will call Natasha, came to me after realizing she had been charging roughly half the market rate for her services for nearly 4 years. She was skilled, experienced, and consistently praised by her clients. When I asked her how she had arrived at her rate, she described a conversation with her first client in which the client had hesitated at her initial quote. "They looked uncomfortable," she told me, and I immediately said, "But I can work with your budget." I dropped the rate on the spot and never raised it. Over 4 years, that single moment of accommodation had cost her, by her own conservative calculation, the equivalent of a year's income. When I asked what she would have done if a friend came to her with the same story, she said without hesitation, "I would have told her she was undervaluing herself." I asked why she could not say that to herself. She was quiet for a long time. "Because it feels different when it's me," she said. "When it's me, asking for more feels like asking for too much." The phenomenon of self-devaluation in professional contexts has been well documented. Linda Babcock and Sarah Lashiver found that women are significantly less likely to negotiate starting salaries and more likely to accept the first offer they receive, a pattern with compounding financial consequences over the course of a career. Women do not lack negotiation skills. Studies show they negotiate effectively on behalf of others. The difficulty arises specifically when they negotiate for themselves, because self-advocacy triggers the script's prohibition against putting your own needs first. Hannah Riley Bowles, Babcock, and Lei Lai demonstrated that this reluctance is not irrational. Women who negotiate assertively for themselves are often penalized socially in ways that men are not, creating a real cost that the script then uses as evidence that self-advocacy is dangerous. There is also a subtler dimension to this problem that goes beyond negotiation. Many women experience what I call ambient guilt around financial success. Even when they earn well, they feel uncomfortable owning their success. They deflect compliments about their achievements. They minimize their role in their own accomplishments. They attribute their income to luck, timing, or the contributions of others. The behavior looks like modesty, but operates as self-sabotage, the script preventing them from fully inhabiting their own competence, because competence combined with financial reward feels dangerously close to the ambition the script told them to avoid. Money, at its most fundamental level, is a reflection of how you value your own time, energy, and expertise. When a woman consistently undercharges, over-delivers, or fails to negotiate for fair compensation, she is not making a financial error. She is expressing a belief about her own worth, and that belief did not originate with her. It was installed by the same script that taught her to be pleasant, to not cause trouble, and to prioritize everyone else's comfort above her own needs. My own relationship with money followed this pattern for years. Early in my career, I accepted speaking engagements for embarrassingly low fees because I felt grateful to be asked at all. I priced my consulting services based on what I thought clients could afford, rather than on the value I delivered. I avoided conversations about compensation because they made me anxious and vaguely ashamed. The turning point came when a male colleague, doing similar work with similar credentials, casually mentioned his rate, which was nearly 3 times mine. The disparity was a shock, but what shocked me more was my immediate internal response. Rather than outrage, I felt doubt. Maybe his work was actually 3 times better than mine. That response taught me something important about how deeply the script can distort perception. It can take an objective fact, a pay gap between equally qualified professionals, and convert it, instantly and convincingly, into evidence of your own inadequacy. That moment of doubt was the script in action. It converted a structural inequity into a personal inadequacy. And this is precisely what the script is designed to do. It keeps women compliant by making them question their own value rather than question the system that undervalues them. I want to note that the relationship between women and money is also complicated by the reality that, in many households, financial dependence is a mechanism of control. A woman who does not earn her own income or who earns significantly less than her partner may find that her economic position limits her choices in every other area of life. She cannot leave a difficult relationship if she cannot support herself. She cannot pursue a career change if the family depends on her partner's income. She cannot set meaningful boundaries if her financial survival depends on someone else's goodwill. Financial independence is not just a matter of comfort or status. It is a matter of freedom, the most practical kind of freedom there is. The path toward financial maturity for women raised under this script involves several concrete shifts. The first is separating your feelings about money from your decisions about money. You can feel uncomfortable asking for a raise and ask for it anyway. You can feel guilty raising your prices and raise them anyway. Feelings are information, not instructions. The discomfort you feel around money is the script's alarm, and by now you know that the alarm is not a reliable guide to right action. The second shift is learning to state the value of your work factually rather than apologetically. This means doing the research to understand what comparable work commands in your field and then communicating that information without hedging, minimizing, or apologizing. Practice saying, in whatever form fits your context, my rate for this engagement is amount, or, based on the scope of this project and industry benchmarks, my fee is amount. These are statements of fact, not acts of aggression. They require no justification beyond the market reality and your own expertise. Rehearsing this language out loud, even to an empty room, can help bridge the gap between what the script says you deserve and what you actually deserve. The first time you say it, your voice may shake. By the 10th time, it will sound like what it is, a professional stating her terms. The third shift, and perhaps the deepest one, is giving yourself permission to want financial abundance without moral guilt. Wanting to be well compensated is not greedy. Wanting financial security is not materialistic. Wanting to build wealth is not unfeminine. These desires are legitimate, practical, and entirely compatible with being a kind, generous, ethical person. The script insists they are contradictory. Reality does not. Ambition, in its healthy form, is simply the desire to use your capacities fully and to be fairly compensated for doing so. It is not the opposite of kindness. It is the opposite of self-abandonment. And a woman who earns what she is worth is not less generous than one who does not. She is simply more honest about the exchange. Financial independence, which is built on the willingness to value your work accurately, is one of the most practical forms of freedom available. It means you stay in jobs, relationships, and situations because you choose to, not because you cannot afford to leave. That kind of freedom does not make you less caring. It makes you more powerful, and power, when it is grounded in self-respect rather than dominance, is nothing to be ashamed of. Chapter 12. Freedom from the Fear of Loneliness. Of all the fears that keep the good girl script firmly in place, the fear of loneliness may be the most ancient and the most effective. It is the fear that operates beneath all the others, the hidden foundation supporting the entire structure. When a woman stays in a relationship that diminishes her, accepts treatment she knows is unacceptable, or abandons her own needs to keep someone close, the engine driving that behavior is almost always the same: the terror of being alone. This fear deserves careful examination because it is not what it appears to be. What most women call a fear of loneliness is actually a fear of something much more specific. It is the fear of facing themselves without the buffer of another person's presence, needs, and validation. Being alone means being left with your own thoughts, your own feelings, and your own assessment of your life, without anyone to perform for, manage, or orient yourself around. For a woman whose identity has been built on her relationships with others, this prospect is genuinely frightening. If I am not someone's partner, someone's caretaker, someone's anchor, who am I? We explored that question in Chapter 7, and if it felt abstract then, it returns here with visceral force, because romantic relationships are the domain where the script exerts its strongest grip. The belief that a woman's life is incomplete without a partner is not just a personal insecurity. It is one of the most deeply embedded cultural messages in existence, reinforced from childhood through every story, every social norm, every casual question from well-meaning relatives. Being in a relationship signals success. Being alone signals failure. This equation is so pervasive that even women who know it is false on an intellectual level feel its weight on an emotional one. The result is that many women make relational decisions not from a place of genuine desire, but from a place of fear. They enter relationships because being alone feels unbearable. They stay in relationships because leaving feels like admitting defeat. They tolerate behavior that erodes their dignity because the alternative, being without a partner, seems worse than any indignity. The fear of loneliness becomes a prison with invisible walls, keeping women in situations that damage them while appearing to protect them. And the cruelest part of this arrangement is that the women who stay out of fear often end up lonelier within their relationships than they would be on their own, because they have sacrificed the one thing that makes genuine connection possible, their authentic selves. I want to make an important distinction here between loneliness and solitude. Loneliness is the painful sense of disconnection, the feeling that you are missing something essential. Solitude is the experience of being alone without distress, of finding your own company sufficient and even nourishing. The psychologist Clark Mustakis drew this distinction decades ago, arguing that loneliness is a condition of disconnection from oneself, while solitude is a condition of rich internal presence. These are fundamentally different states, and the difference lies entirely in the relationship you have with yourself. Learning to be comfortable in solitude is not an exercise in deprivation. It is an exercise in self-sufficiency, in discovering that you can provide yourself with much of the companionship, comfort, and meaning that you have been outsourcing to others. A woman who has no internal relationship with herself, who does not know what she values, enjoys, or needs outside the context of a relationship, will experience being alone as loneliness regardless of the circumstances. She could be surrounded by friends and still feel empty because the emptiness is internal, not situational. Conversely, a woman who has developed a solid relationship with herself can be alone without being lonely because she brings her own substance to the experience. The fear of loneliness cannot be solved by finding or keeping a partner. It can only be solved by building the internal foundation that makes solitude bearable and eventually enriching. And building that foundation requires exactly the kind of self-knowledge, boundary setting, and identity work we have been discussing throughout this book. There is also a practical dimension to this that I want to address directly. Many women I work with describe staying in relationships that they know are unhealthy, not because they love their partner, but because they cannot imagine the logistics and emotional landscape of being alone. Who will I spend weekends with? What will I do on holidays? What will people think? How will I manage financially? These concerns are real and should not be dismissed. But they are logistical problems, not existential ones. They have solutions. What does not have a simple solution is the slow erosion of self that comes from staying in a relationship that requires you to abandon who you are. I have listened to women describe relationships in which their opinions were dismissed, their boundaries violated, their contributions taken for granted, and their presence valued primarily for the functions they performed. When I asked why they stayed, the answer was rarely, "Because I love him." It was more often, "Because I am afraid of what happens if I leave." That fear, the fear of the unknown loneliness, keeps women in situations where they are already experiencing the deepest loneliness of all, the loneliness of being in a relationship where you are not truly known or valued. This is one of the most painful ironies of the script. The very thing it promises to protect you from, isolation and disconnection, is exactly what it produces when you follow it faithfully enough. The path toward freedom from this fear follows the same principles we have explored throughout the book. It begins with awareness, recognizing that the fear of loneliness is driving your decisions, and that those decisions are costing you more than the loneliness ever would. It continues with the practical work of building a life that has substance and meaning, independent of any romantic relationship, friendships, interests, professional engagement, creative expression, physical well-being. These are not substitutes for romantic connection. They are the foundation that makes genuine romantic connection possible, because they ensure that you enter relationships from desire rather than desperation. I have worked with many women who, upon building this foundation, discovered something unexpected. They found that they actually enjoyed being alone. Not all the time, not in every circumstance, but in a way that surprised them, given how much they had feared it. They enjoyed the freedom to structure their own time, to make decisions without negotiation, to discover their own rhythms and preferences. Some eventually chose new partnerships from a much stronger and clearer position. Others chose to remain on their own, not because they had given up on love, but because their standards had risen. They were no longer willing to accept any relationship just to avoid being alone. They were willing to wait for one that actually deserved them. Mature intimacy, the kind of closeness that actually nourishes both people, is only possible between two individuals who are each whole on their own. If you enter a relationship to fill a void in yourself, the relationship will be organized around that void. You will cling, you will accommodate, you will tolerate the intolerable. And the script will tell you, this is love, when it is actually dependency disguised as love. True partnership looks different. It is two whole people choosing to share their lives, not two incomplete people trying to make a single functional whole. It requires the ability to be alone without panic, to disagree without abandonment, to maintain your own identity within the shared space of a relationship. These abilities are not innate, they are developed through the kind of inner work this book describes. I am not suggesting that wanting a partner is a weakness or that relationships are inherently compromising. I am suggesting that the quality of your relationships depends entirely on the quality of your relationship with yourself. When you are no longer afraid of being alone, you gain the freedom to choose relationships that actually enhance your life rather than merely fill your fear. And that freedom, the freedom to choose rather than to cling, transforms everything about how you love and how you allow yourself to be loved. It means that when you say yes to a relationship, it is a genuine yes, born of desire rather than desperation. And if you find yourself alone for a time, it is not a crisis. It is a season, one in which you have the opportunity to deepen your acquaintance with the most important person in your life, which is yourself. Conclusion. We have traveled a considerable distance together through these pages. We began with the origins of the Good Girl script, tracing it from the earliest childhood messages through the cultural systems that sustain it. We examined its costs, the burnout, the lost identity, the learned helplessness, the gap between the life you were living and the life you wanted. And we explored the practical tools for change, recognizing the scripts, building a new identity, saying no, establishing boundaries, restoring self-esteem, confronting your relationship with money and ambition, and freeing yourself from the fear of being alone. I want to return to something I said at the beginning, because it is important enough to say again. The desire to be good is not the problem. Kindness, generosity, consideration for others, these are genuinely valuable qualities, and nothing in this book asks you to abandon them. The problem arises when being good becomes the only way you know how to exist, when it replaces authenticity rather than expressing it, when it costs you your boundaries, your voice, your health, and your sense of who you actually are. The work I have described here is not a rebellion against your past. Anger may be part of the process, but the work is quieter and more durable. The careful, patient reconstruction of a life built on your own terms. It means looking honestly at what you believe, where those beliefs came from, and which ones you want to carry forward. It means learning to tolerate the discomfort of change without interpreting it as a sign that you are doing something wrong, and it means giving yourself the same compassion and consideration that you have spent a lifetime offering to everyone else. Being yourself is not a destination you arrive at once and occupy forever. It is an ongoing practice, a series of daily choices to show up honestly rather than perform convincingly. Some days it will feel natural. Other days it will feel frightening. Both are part of the process. You have spent years, perhaps decades, proving that you can be what others need you to be. You have demonstrated beyond any doubt that you are capable, resilient, and strong. The question that remains is whether you can turn that strength inward, not to serve someone else's expectations, but to honor your own truth. I want to leave you with one final exercise. Before you close this book, write a short letter to yourself, not to the woman you think you should be, and not to the good girl the script designed. Write to the woman you are right now, in this moment, having read these pages. Tell her what you see in her. Tell her what you want for her. Tell her what you are willing to do differently, starting tomorrow. And tell her that she is allowed to want what she wants, even if she cannot yet say it out loud. Keep this letter somewhere private. Return to it when the script gets loud again, because it will. The letter is your own voice, written down, reminding you of what you knew to be true before the noise returned. I believe you can, and I believe the life waiting on the other side of that choice is worth every moment of discomfort it takes to get there.
Thank you for listening until the very end. If you enjoyed this audiobook, support the video with a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new releases.